Hello and welcome to the Transfer Flow podcast. And on today's episode, we look back at the Champions League final. How did we get Inter Milan so wrong? How could PSG set an attacking blueprint for the rest of Europe? And on the topic of exciting French players, we look at a French Algerian linked with a big money move to Manchester City. That's all on today's episode of the Transfer Flow. So we're back for another Monday edition of the podcast, and I'm joined by Hayden Van Brewer. How you doing, man?
Yeah, doing really well. Trying to recover after that just crazy, unexpected Champions League final. You and Neil did an awesome job previewing it, but even with all that, I don't think we could have seen that coming. No, I think you guys queued it up in terms of Inter's lack of rotation, PSG's sort of aggression, and just really intelligent tactics. And this ended up being a worst case scenario for Inter, obviously, but. No, I think a lot of the things that you guys talked about, I really enjoyed that one, really set this one up for the things that people probably saw in the game.
What I found myself thinking about watching this match was the Real Madrid-Liverpool final, the last one, not the Bale one, where Liverpool had been kind of the best team in the world, I think, over the previous 6 months going into that final. They didn't win the league that year, but they had been flying. And Real Madrid had been kind of not entirely lucking, but kind of lucking their way through in the Champions League the way they do. And then in the final, everyone just had a great game for Real Madrid. Like Danny Carvajal had an incredible game for Real Madrid. And Liverpool were not that great. And ultimately, that kind of decided it. And watching this match, I thought, look, we'll get into some of the tactical stuff and I think we're all big fans of Luis Enrique and of this PSG team generally. But you also can't really legislate for a bunch of guys having absolutely shocking games. And someone like Di Marco, who has been so integral to this team, just had a nightmare on the day. And Inter ended up outshot 23-8. The XG was 3.1 to 0.5. I talked about their long balls in that preview, and for their long ball success, it was 11th of 15 in their across their Champions League campaign. For the total number of long balls completed, it was 8th of 15. So it just felt like they didn't really have an out ball. Bastoni and Di Marco weren't getting them out of the back either. And obviously after they go a goal down, then this is the nightmare scenario. This is what did Inter do now? Can they press their way back into this game? And basically the answer was no.
Yeah, really difficult. I think the broadcasters actually had some really good bits on how little Thuram and Martinez in particular had sort of played in the month leading up to it.
Sure.
So it sort of felt like, even though they maybe were, let's call it 90% in terms of passing medical checks, in terms of match sharpness, in terms of ability to really address the needs of the game, be more aggressive when they needed to, it felt like they maybe lacked that extra gear. And with how deep Inter were sitting, it put a lot of pressure on their midfield. It felt like Barella and Mkhitaryan in particular were just covering tons of ground, chasing in sort of man down situations with PSG's overloads. And just they were putting in a huge shift defensively, and then they struggled to get out of the back in terms of their passing. When they moved Dumfries higher, they weren't able to sort of get him the ball in the situations in the space that he had gotten it in previous games. DeMarco had sort of been one of the key guys in giving them those passes into the front players and getting out of that group, connecting with those midfielders, even under pressure. And they just weren't able to do it. And giving the ball back over and over again to this PSG team is really a recipe for disaster. And like you said, going behind and needing to then chase the game and play something a little different never was going to suit Inter in the game.
Yeah, and it just felt like even their strengths weren't really working for them in this match. They attempted 19 crosses and only one of them got completed. But PSG seemed to know PSG knew what their weaknesses were and seemed to kind of have a plan. We have that bit from the kickoff. They basically kick for touch, right? Kind of like a rugby team. They're like, right, we're going to get up the field and we're not even going to try and win the first ball. What we're going to try and do is just kick for territory and then try and press them to death and box them in. And they were able to do this so successfully. And like you said, so often those passes out of the back you were trying to pick somebody out who's 30 yards away through a congested midfield, and PSG were just able to win these balls back again and again. So it was like PSG knew they needed to have one of their best pressing games so far in order to force these errors, and they basically did. Whereas Inter, PSG had like an 88% pass accuracy in this game. So that's higher than all 3 games against Arsenal in the Champions League this season. It's higher than they had against Bayern away, which they lost, Villa away, which they lost, Liverpool away, which they won, but which was pretty uncomfortable for them for stretches. Even their home draw with PSV. So it just felt like Inter seemed to have, whether they didn't have the legs, whether they didn't have the system, they just couldn't really get PSG out of their stride, and they were never in their own.
Yeah, I think there was definitely a lack of comfort after seeing how PSG in transition had cut teams open this season between Barcola, Doué, Kvaratskhelia, Dembele, that had been such a real strength. So there, I think, was probably some fear there. But it's not like this Inter team hadn't pressed teams high this year. Something they had done a lot in the league. I think they were in the top sort of 4 or 5 teams in PPTA. Like, it's a gear that they had that it felt like maybe they just couldn't utilize, either because of sort of the fatigue of the squad or because they felt like they would have been too vulnerable in transition. And I think maybe there is some element of that Inzaghi was worried about Acerbi, who looked like he had kind of lost his head by the end of the game with frustration and was sort of beat for pace and behind. I think there maybe was some fear of that happening even more regularly if they pressed too high and got stretched. But I think because of that, they maybe struggled to deal with the somewhat predictable tactic for PSG of moving Dembele out and leaving those center backs to just sort of occupy nobody in the central space and use Dembele in wide areas to create overloads to stress the midfield of Inter, knowing that the front line of Inter wasn't really putting enough pressure to really like condense the space and close those areas down. And so I think that was a really good tactic. And I was surprised to some extent that there wasn't a counter for Inter, because it felt like that was the tactic that PSG was going to be likely to use. It's what has made Dembele such a strong player in European football this season.
And then you wonder if in the Barca games, Inter were slightly helped by the fact that Barca's incredibly high line means that Inter only really need to press like half the pitch, basically. Whereas I think it was after the first or second goal, Inter tried to go man for man for a stretch. And there was one bit where Donnarumma passed out to Hakimi, and Hakimi was by his own penalty area, like out by the flank. And Di Marco was having to run 30 or 40 yards to get close to him. And obviously by the time he's got there, Hakimi's just picked out his next pass. And it just felt like that meant, because they were playing out so deep, Inter were having to run the length of the pitch constantly. And they are an older team. They are a team that doesn't really want to be doing that. This just creates more discomfort in them. Well, Ousmane Dembele, what do you think was so special about this season for him? Like, obviously we've talked about his conversion into more of a pressing demon, but do you think that he's obviously now been voted or decided to be, the most valuable player in the Champions League? He's being talked about for the Ballon d'Or, understandably. But what do you think it is about Luis Enrique's tactics that's kind of unlocked him?
Yeah, so I think what we can say is the Ballon d'Or is still a ways away, but he has been given European Player of the Season, and I think it's sort of twofold. I think the pressing bit is really a great one to underline it. I think that's something that as a coach you always want to highlight. You want to say, look, this guy's clearly so talented. He can score with both feet. He can dribble. He's so quick. But also look at what he does defensively. It's sort of a lesson for the rest of the team. If your top playmaker is doing the hard yards as well, then there's really no excuse for anybody, right? So for a coach, I think it's predictable that you would compliment that, and it's something that Dembele definitely showed, that sort of humbleness and that hard work all season. press intelligently. But I think it's really the tactical flexibility and the intelligence of the players. So when you talk about Hakimi coming deep into that sort of right fullback slot, like, I mean, we've watched Hakimi for years and years. This is a guy that flies up as a winger at times, just incredibly fast player, athletic, direct. He really known for what he does on just the attacking part of the field. But like the ability of him to come deep, invite that pressure, be able to control the ball out of the back and pass in these different ways. Again, knowing that it's going to force DeMarco to have to make that large pressing run because Inter, again, have a front five instead of a front six, right? Pressing them. It's just so intelligent. And I think it's the way that this group has learned together that's really impressive. And it has allowed a player like Dembele that has a lot of different skills to sort of figure out like, okay, we can actually use you in lots of different ways. We can, if we like your matchup out wide instead of someone else, we can take advantage of that. Because if you go wide, we still have a player like Doué centrally who is very comfortable operating in a lot of different positions as well. We don't need you to just be a dribbler. We don't need you to just be a runner. You can sort of pick and choose your moments. And I think there's a type of player where like that sort of setup gets the best of him. One of the players I've always shouted for this is Paul Pogba. When he was in the Juventus team, it felt like that Juventus midfield that had Marquisio and Vidal and these guys that could do a bit of everything.
Yeah.
That got the best out of Pogba. It allowed him to sort of be intelligent, pick and choose his moments. And when he was in a midfield that sort of had like a lot of structure to it, it just didn't get the best out of him. And I think the flexibility and the intelligence of these other PSG players and how much they've learned under Enrique to be a bit flexible has gotten the most out of Dembele. And at the end of the day, yeah, you can say that maybe the coaches want to give it to him for his defending, but I think at the end of the day, it's his attacking intelligence and the way that he's put his game together this year is like really, really impressive. And it's really cool to see him go to a different level than what he was doing, at Barcelona, a team that paid so much for him.
Yeah, where he was kind of expected to I don't know, to play a more conventional game, I guess, and also probably to take fewer risks. Like fundamentally, he needs to be empowered, doesn't he, to be the agent of chaos in the team. What I wonder about is how much of is whether we can expect this to persist. You know, whether they can just run this thing back and try and do it again. Because really, the only team that had much of a counter to it this season was Arsenal. And Arsenal, I think, were probably the best defensive team in Europe this season. And even then, Arsenal still lost to them in both legs of the semi-final. Whether one, they can just try and run it back. And whether two, it can be a blueprint for other sides to follow. So let's deal with the first thing first. I mean, obviously, Barcola has kind of slipped out of contention, and maybe they end up having to sell him, and maybe that weakens them. You know, it might be one of those seasons where you've kind of got everybody there and it gives you a bunch of different looks. But do you think that this is something that they can just try again, or a team's going to be able to deal with it? Because right now, it felt in this game like nobody had any, like Inter, a very good defensive side. And once you throw guys like Hakimi into the mix as well, that beautifully worked first goal, you start to wonder, like, what do you do to prevent this happening? How do you stop PSGing you?
Yeah, I think in terms of the group itself, their group is in a really good place. Like whether it's Barcola, Gonzalo Ramos, Kang In Lee, I think they have a number of really good players who had good, not great seasons. They could get a fee for, and also might be happy to keep them. They're going to have some choices there. Beraldo, they've sort of bled in this year as sort of you'd almost call him like heir apparent to Marquinhos, or a guy that will start to take games from Marquinhos as he's crossing 30, and sort of you probably don't want him playing every single game of the whole year. You don't need to in Ligue anyways, but I think they have a lot of good things in the squad. Again, as you guys previewed, very young team. There's a lot of they're in a really good position. We sort of talked previously and in Neil's article, Inter maybe at the end of this cycle and they need to retool, and you're not expecting another 2 Champions League and finals in 3 years for that group. They're going to need to restructure a bit and be a bit creative in how they do that. PSG are set up where they don't need to make changes. They have options on how they can sort of pick and improve the group, but it's a young group. They're really set to go again. So in terms of that bit, I think they're really stable. Now, how are teams going to sort of counter and go about it? I think the biggest challenge for PSG is going to continue to be the fact that they're not pushed to their limit during the year in their own domestic competition. We'll see if they're able to maintain that sort of level of performance. I think especially as like if they lose a midfielder, I think João Neves and Vitinha, what they showed right now was just like really incredible. There's like a balance thing of like, if you're missing one of those guys, does it sort of throw things off? Does it make it harder for Fabian Ruiz to really take advantage of what he's good at, of sort of like filling the holes and letting those guys sort of run around and cover and control the game? I think that's more of the question, but I think PSG, looking at it today, it's pretty hard to picture them not in the top group coming into the Champions League for next year. I mean, I think the robustness of the group is really, really strong. And yeah, they're definitely a favorite to keep this thing going.
Well, yeah. I mean, of course, Warren Zaire-Emery, who a couple of years ago was like the poster boy for this new PSG, has kind of dropped out of contention. And then late on in this game, we got a goal from Seni Mayulu, who is another teenager. Like, because the team is so young, they've bought themselves time to bring through some interesting pieces in the richest environment for producing footballers in the world. So they've got a lot of time there. On that second point, though, about whether other teams can start to imitate this was occurring to me during the game, because we've spent a lot of time talking recently about teams wanting strikers. And when we're talking about strikers, we come back to the same few names, the guys who aren't at top teams yet. So it is Šeško and Gyökeres and Ekitike, these guys who are very interesting players and who might all end up being top players in top leagues, but who right now do have question marks about them, all of them. And the prices we're talking about are, 80 million euros plus for Ekitike and Šeško, 65 million euros plus for Gyökeres. When you look at those prices and you look at the lack of certainty, is there an argument for teams being more creative with who they use up front? Now, not everybody has an Ousmane Dembele, but the season before City signed Erling Haaland, they scored 99 goals in the Premier League. Their top scorer was De Bruyne. He had 15. This season, Arsenal just kind of went for their most striker-shaped guy when they had injury issues. They were like, Mikel Merino, you look like a kind of striker from 1999. You can play up front for us. But if they'd had Saka fit, or even if they just had a little bit more depth, would it not have made more sense for them to try and use Saka there or Martinelli there or something instead? It just seems like, rather than going for somebody who does fit the role, but maybe a quality downgrade, might it not make sense to try and do something a bit more creative and go for somebody who's really good, even if they're not what you expect a striker to look like?
Yeah, I think possibly. It depends. I think there's going to be a variety here where teams are trying different things. We have sort of these two conflicting trends right now, where it's like, yes, I think that's one sort of pathway where these teams that are want to control the game with possession and care a lot about their defensive shape, and we're going to have the ball high up the field, so we need to stop transition. They're asking their, let's just call center forward for now, right? Obviously, we're talking about, are we pulling that role or not? But they're going to ask that player to be possibly involved a bit in build-up. They're going to ask that player to do a lot of defending, right? They're going to be leading that sort of defensive press and doing a lot of stuff out of possession. That's going to look really different than what we've also talked about a lot, is these, in the Premier League in particular, Portuguese mid-block teams that want to play in transition, that want to win set pieces, that probably, like, again, Nottingham Forest have been pretty happy to have a Chris Wood as their sort of main striker. Newcastle are not unhappy that they have Alexander Isak. Again, obviously, these are really top examples, but I think to some extent, it's going to be a game where teams are going to work with the talent that they feel like they have is available. And I do wonder, though, I think there is a real question if there are some maybe let's say sort of mid-table or bottom half of the table teams that go, look, we really can't compete in the striker market. Let's give it a go with something a little bit different, even at our own price point and at our own level. But it's going to depend. I think the teams that don't play as much of a possession style and don't control the game as much, and maybe ask less in possession of their forward, aside from maybe get in the box, score us a goal. Like, we just need you to take the chances that come and be an outlet when we need you to just basically, throw some center backs around and get us out of the back. They're probably still going to be contesting with center forward profiles, and they're going to be less concerned about one that drops in. So I think it's going to depend a bit on the team strategy. For some of these possession teams, though, yeah, I definitely think we'll see it. I think Liverpool are a team that have shown even this year with slot, with Luis Diaz playing it sort of as that center forward a lot this year, bringing in Verts, having Cody Gakpo, Salah has played a bit sometimes in that role. There's going to be a lot of rotation there, and what they're asking of these players is different than what they'd ask if they were just rolling out Darwin Nunez sort of up top or something like that. So I think you'll see a variety of tactics based on what the team's kind of main goal is.
Yeah, I guess this is one of the things. Look, I don't want to rag on Ligue 1 when Ligue 1 has just produced, the Champions League winner. But I guess with PSG, you do need to build a team to win the Champions League, and it'll probably be good enough to to win Ligue 1. Whereas if you're building Liverpool, for example, then they need to be able to match up to these huge sides in the Champions League, but they also need to be able to break down those deeper defensive sides, as you were talking about, that are actually full of talent in the Premier League as well. So I guess that you do still want more of a physical presence. Bournemouth, when they've done it this season, they've still got Semenyo, who's a really exceptional aerial target. So it matters less when they use Ouattara up front. PSG have Kvicha, who is a big physical presence, but it hasn't really bothered them that they don't have the aerial guy, I suppose, because they're willing to try and pick their way through you. I don't know. What other lessons can we take from this, I guess? Like, it frustrated me a little bit, I must say, after the game. These are just my pet gripes. That PSG are a great team, but they are also a propaganda project. And after the game, it did feel like the propaganda project has succeeded, because suddenly we had everyone saying, this is what a great day this is for European football. Like, what a wonderful moment. And also it felt like people were overpraising PSG, finding guys like Barcola and Neves, and particularly Doué, who were all well-known players before PSG signed them, and they paid big fees. They paid a really big fee for Doué, actually. So it's not like I don't want to give them credit, but I was a little bit annoyed by those couple of things.
Yeah, I think there is the how reproducible is it if every player you bought is worth 50 million plus?
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
There is yes, a lot of these guys are French, and maybe these guys have played together in youth national teams or in other settings, but how reproducible is this for I guess a team in a major city, right? Part of the allure of this is that it's Paris. It's this major European city with large population, a lot of people playing soccer, and that you have this real opportunity to grassroots it up and bring these guys through. But you paid over 50 million for every single player. So That's not exactly the case here. Yeah, I think maybe that's the little bit of the weird bit at the end, is that it is a young group, and it is a coach that has really imprinted a good style of play and improved the team and made it a very likable team in the way they play. But yeah, that element, I was speaking with Rishi just earlier on how Al Khalifi kind of coming on the broadcast, followed by Twitch, YouTube, IShowSpeed and stuff like that. It sort of got a bit strange after a really nice interview with Dembele, where you're like, wow, what a great guy. Look how much he believes in this. And then it sort of went to what actually is going on here right now?
The most evil broadcast possible.
Yeah, it was a very weird way to sort of end. I mean, for me, I kind of turned it off when that was sort of, as that was going on. I was sort of wow, what a weird taste to leave in the mouth afterwards of this project. So yeah, a very what did we learn besides, you can spend a lot of money and there are better ways to do it, but also they did it in a really good way, and there's things to applaud in terms of the sporting side. again, a bit. I continue to struggle with that side of it in that situation, especially when they're not the only team doing that. There's a lot of that going on, and it does sort of ask some difficult questions.
Yeah, I kind of felt afterwards like it's kind of like applauding Bayern Munich for signing like the best young German players. Like, well done, Bayern. On the other side, then, when we're talking about spending money, and you mentioned Neil's excellent article on Inter Milan before, we know that they're coming to the end for this particular group. It might be that they're coming to the end of the Inzaghi tenure there as well. Like, we haven't really had any confirmation on that yet. If they want to start retooling here, where do they begin? Because they don't actually have a lot of sellable assets in this side, but Bastoni has been linked with moves away for years, but is clearly quite happy there. There aren't a huge number of other players who they can sell for big fees. So how do they begin trying to turn over a squad which they've allowed to get very old, kind of on the understanding that we're going to give it a really good try to win the Champions League?
Yeah, I don't have a perfect answer for that. Like, they're going to be shopping the free transfers. They're going to be looking for guys that I think fit specific profiles. Like, I think they're probably going to continue to sort of play with two strikers, regardless if it's Simeone or not. I think they kind of need to. Like, that's been a key part of their rotation, is the groups of two strikers in, two strikers out. Sure. I think they'll continue to do something like that. The place I think they need to start for me is, again, maybe figuring out what a Cherby's sort of minute load can be, but then also in the midfield. I think that's probably the starting point. I think they are possibly signing Kyle Enrique. I'm not sure if that's been completed yet or if that's waiting for sort of the June to end or where that sort of stacks up in terms of the player's contract. I kind of think, that's fine. But I think in the midfield is probably where the biggest questions are being asked of, like, look, do we need to make a little bit of investment here? Do we go out and try to sign another sort of more veteran player that's out of contract, but then pair them with, kind of quote unquote an understudy with the understanding that understudy is still probably going to play a pretty sizable amount of games. But I think that's going to be the part where they need to retool the most, and that will sort of enlighten us the most on the direction of where that team's going to go. The most sellable asset of the team is probably Nico Barella, which I think they're probably very scared to lose, in addition to Inzaghi. If they lose one of those two, I think that's where the panic button starts to get pressed a little bit.
But even Barella, he's quietly, I think he's 28 now. Like, a bunch of these guys have quietly ticked up in age, and their younger guys are people like Bisek, who maybe he'll have attracted some suitors in the Champions League, but he's 24, but he kind of feels very particular to the system.
Sure.
I don't know. It is a little bit of a scary time for them. And Serie A is having some interesting upheaval at the moment. You've got Gasperini heading off to Roma. God knows what's going on with Conte. But Allegri, of course, getting...
Sarri might be back in at Lazio.
Yes, everybody's kind of running it back. But like from 10 years ago, with Allegri going to Milan and Sarri maybe going back to Lazio, we could be on the verge of a little bit of a down period here. And that's, would you say that that's the downside of sticking with an older team for longer, that you expect to have a period in the, I guess, like in the doldrums?
Yeah, I have to imagine their goal was to do as well as they could with the group, to then cash in European competition, to then hopefully fund and make that down period shorter or less painful. Again, they're not going to have no cash, and if these guys are being let go and not sold to other places, then they are still opening up pretty sizable salary chunks for these guys. So I think the issue is the ability for them to compete at the very, very top of it with, Napoli signing Kevin De Bruyne. You have to imagine Juventus are going to be trying to configure whatever loan with option to buy or mandatory buy options they can do. it's going to be a really challenging year in Serie A. I also think AC Milan will probably rebound. I think that's a team that is sort of too strong not to, in terms of their personnel, and that they're going to try to rejig to get things right. So yeah, it's definitely, it's the risk of this it's always the risk with going with more experienced players, is that you have a group that hopefully can problem solve and get through for a period, but if the level drops too low, then yeah, you're going to have a challenging period rebuilding and bleeding in those new guys. It's a group that I think, as was mentioned repeatedly, use the fewest amount of players in the league, and you're going to need to get minutes for younger guys to take on that load.
And with the extended Champions League as well, which I think, as much as I was a doubter, like, we really enjoyed talking about this edition of the Champions League, and maybe we just got lucky that it was a particularly good edition, but it does feel like a bit of a win for the format that we've had so many outstanding games on the way to the final. Okay, so I think that we've exhausted everything that we could say about a 5-0 victory for PSG in the Champions League final. That's the one thing, watching it, I thought this Inter team does deserve better than going out like this. And I was desperate. I was like, do something, please, so that we have something to talk about. But also, I was like, is the second half of this just going to be PSG scoring goals on the counter-attack? And in fact, that was what it was. But there's an interesting transfer that we were talking about, which is David Ornstein reports that Manchester City are pushing to get Rayan Ait-Nouri through the door. Now, this is a player we've seen linked around for quite some time. He's been linked to Manchester City before. He's been in the Premier League for years now, but he is still only 23. I think he's 24 later this week. What do you think it would say if Manchester City end up trying to get him over the line? Because we have been saying for a long time, even if they're not your first choice, do you not at least want to have like a real left back in the squad? And they went for Gomez a couple of years ago, and then were immediately like, this was a horrible idea. Does this suggest that Pep is maybe rethinking the ways that he's used fullbacks over the last couple of years?
I think so. I think Ait-Nouri is a player that's played a lot as a wingback. In terms of his profile, looks like a guy that would very comfortably play as a fullback in a back four as well. And so, yeah, I think this is possibly a different option. I'm not sure if it signals a direct change. I think the player that it affects the most is Gvardiol, who did a lot, both sort of as center back, playing as what you'd expect as a center back, and then also flying forward, getting, I think we talked about at times, getting a lot more shots than a lot of other players, and contributing a lot offensively. I think this is sort of a push to sort of stabilize him in the back line. Ait-Nouri would be interesting. This would be a player that does have some crossing threat, some ability to get forward on their strong side on the outside and get around teams maybe a bit. I wonder if that's sort of going to be part of the configuration to replace Kevin De Bruyne, how they're going to reconfigure things on the inside, that maybe it's not just going to be Doku wide on the touchline and then Gvardiol sort of tucked in central underneath it, that maybe Ait-Nouri is coming forward and, again, at least at the moment, a Jack Grealish inside. I would say with O'Reilly has sort of played a bit at the end of the season and maybe looks a bit more of a fit to kind of follow underneath an Ait-Nouri in terms of like a similar profile and being asked to do some similar things. So yeah, it'd be really interesting. I'd like to see City have that option, and it would be cool. It feels like the sort of trend to a lot of teams building with a back three and playing in that sort of setup was something that, with the inverted fullbacks that Pep sort of switched to a couple seasons ago, it'd be really interesting to see if he sort of is the guy that flips it back to a back four and kind of changes the game again for a different tactical reason to try to regain an edge in a competitive Premier League race.
Yeah, I mean, with Pep, it just always feels like it's always felt to me like it's less important to track like what he's actually doing with certain roles on the pitch than to remember the thing he's really scared of, which is like losing control and counterattacks. And I think when you see everything through that lens, then everything he's doing kind of makes sense, right? It's all like fear orientated. Ait-Nouri is an interesting player for them, and certainly I like it more than those links to Cambiasso we saw back in January, where they were kind of, they want a fullback who's comfortable on the ball and he's a biggish guy, but Ait-Nouri, like you say, can do a variety of stuff. Like, we saw him when he was younger in the Premier League being much more of a crossing, aggressive type player, and he still does complete a lot of dribbles for a player in his position. He gets a lot of touches in the box for a player in his position. We've also seen his defensive success trend upwards every single season he's been in the Premier League. So he has gradually become a more effective defensive player, even if he doesn't have super high volume defensively. I don't think that he's going to be a problem for their possession game at all. The question is, what do you lose, I guess, by getting him on the pitch? I mean, if you can park him out in a wide area, then maybe it means that instead of playing an out and out winger, you can play someone like Marmoush on the left, and he'll be able to take up more of an inside forward role, which I guess should be your aim. What do you think is a reasonable price for a player like this, though? Because Wolves are going to drive a hard bargain. Wolves have been selling really, really well lately. You know, we've covered this with Neto, with Kilman, and now with Cunha as well. But Ait-Nouri, there don't seem to be that many suitors right now, as much as we've heard smoke about him in the past. So how do you ballpark a price here if you're Man City?
Yeah, I think a kind of 40-45 million kind of number is going to be the line that City are trying to get under and Wolves are trying to get over. I think somewhere in that ballpark is going to be what's happening. I think if you're Wolves, you're trying to figure out how much can we get for an important player that doesn't kind of push us further into that relegation trouble. We don't want to be losing. If we're already losing Cunha, we don't. We're not just dying for cash. We do need players to help us out. There's a Leeds team coming up that could buck that promotion trend. So they're going to be a little bit wary in that regard. At the same time, if you can get that kind of cash for a fullback, that's a real advantage for building out the rest of your squad. And City will obviously want to try to minimize that because they're going to continue to try to add to the team. I like that Nouri could add some crossing, like you said. I know that's not necessarily exact. That's sort of the Ait-Nouri in the memory of when he sort of burst onto the scene, and you were like, this guy is getting forward, and like he's really truly trying to make an impact, right? I love the idea of them having a sort of strong foot on the outside, fullback, crossing the ball to Erling Haaland, and then allowing Marmoush to come inside. Again, maybe that's pushing more on Bernardo Silva to be inside in that role as well, and maybe there's some reconfiguration there with Kovacic, Rodri, and Nico Gonzalez rotating through the holding midfield sort of roles. Again, I don't know what it means exactly for Doku or Jack Grealish. It feels like Grealish would maybe be more suited to having that overlapping fullback, right? That's what he loves. Whereas Doku maybe not as much. So I don't know if there's any sort of signal in there, but it's definitely a profile I'd be excited to see City add. I think probably speaking for the transfer flow as a collective, we are excited for anything that allows City to take advantage of the sort of Erling Haaland Marmoush combo, and that plays into City leaning into being more direct and physical at times, in addition to the fact that they're never going to lose that identity of being a Pep Guardiola passing control team. We know they can do that for days, but we want to see them have that contrast of styles, that extra gear, and just the physicality that makes Erling Haaland just like you just can't turn away when he's playing. It's something exciting could happen, and City leaning into that more feels like something that could really shake up the title race, especially if Liverpool are trying to, throw the bank at Bayer Leverkusen for Florian Wirtz.
Yeah, it does feel that the strange thing about Man City this season was how one note they ended up being at times. You know, when Haaland got injured, we said, well, look, now they've got to play Marmoush up front. And historically, we'd have said this isn't that much of a problem. Like, there was a time when Pep would play Foden up front or De Bruyne up front or whoever he wanted and would still get enough attack out of them. And at times this season, we were saying, well, plan A's gone. So what are they going to do? That feels like a very strange position for a Pep team to be in. So if this makes them a little bit more diverse and a little bit less easy to set up for, then it's going to make for a more exciting Premier League campaign, like you say. I'm excited about this one. I want this one to happen for sure. less excited about Thierry Reinders. But if they get in Cherki and Rayan Ait-Nouri, then suddenly we're pumping again. All the Ryans. Get them all in.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, and I think it's worth making the point. We sort of talked with the PSG section, talking about these French players, but like France is the powerhouse right now in creating talent. Like the French national team squad is 2 or 3 squads deep that could be top 10 or 15 national teams. Like that's how much talent there is, and there's a reason that we're hearing a lot of rumors about these French players right now, is because there's a lot of talent. And the league with the TV deal and things like that, there might not be the finances for some of these teams to keep a hold of these really talented players. So yeah, would be a really interesting direction. Cherki and Ait-Nouri would be, I think, one that like we wouldn't have necessarily seen coming like a year ago. I think it would have felt like, wow, that's a little bit more like a little bit more risk, or Ait-Nouri, like a conventional left-sided wide player. That's not always what we associate with Pep Guardiola. But right now it does feel like with the Marmoush, Erling Haaland combo in the advanced areas, that maybe that could actually be a really good play for something like that to happen. So yeah, we'll keep our eyes peeled this summer.
This is what we're going to end up with. French Algerians are going to become to Manchester City what Basque guys are to Arsenal right now. They check your passport on the way in. Right. Okay, I think that's all we've got time for today. Hayden, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for offering insight on a game which my notes were just like unhappy face. Like that was what I drew during the game. Obviously, we're going to be covering a load of transfers. We're going to dip our toes in some of the summer tournaments as well over the coming months. But where can people get more of your interesting insight?
Yeah, I'm H Van Brewer on Blue Sky, and we'll probably be following those things as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much, everybody who's been listening or watching. Thank you for taking this journey with us towards the Champions League final this season. We've really, really enjoyed it. Make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you leave us a 5-star review if you're listening to a podcast, and send in your questions for future episodes. We'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.